Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. A new report by Environics Institute, Future Skills Center, and the Diversity Institute exploring challenges in the nonprofit employment has highlighted a disturbing and perhaps surprising finding. Job satisfaction in the nonprofit sector appears to be lower than in the private or public sectors. In a sector that focuses on meaningful work, what's driving a significant number of workers to feel dissatisfied? And what does this mean for the future, given the existing talent crunch and the need for recruiting younger people to work in the sector? Joining us to discuss these important issues is Dr. Wendy Cukier, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University. An award-winning diversity leader and best-selling author, Wendy also leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and is the academic research director for the Future Skills Center. Welcome back to the podcast, Wendy.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
Now, first, can you tell us about the Future Skills Center and the Diversity Institute and why those organizations felt it was important to initiate the Burden of Care report? What was it about the research that you thought was so important to explore?
So the Diversity Institute is part of the consortium of Toronto Metropolitan University, the Conference Board of Canada, and Blueprint, which are charged with the Future Skills Center, which is a big investment by the federal government. And we worked with Environics Institute on a yearly basis to do quite a large-scale survey on employment and skills. So the survey that this research was derived from is a much broader, more general study of which includes responses from 5,000 Canadians and has been collected over a number of years. When we looked at the data and we started to explore issues around job satisfaction over the first few years of the survey, we did see this pattern, which we thought was worth exploring in more detail. And so Environics took the lead in producing the report called The Burden of Care to really tease out some of the data specific to the nonprofit sector and compare it to the private sector and government. And as you said, some of the findings were quite surprising.
So what was it about the Burden of Care report findings that you really found particularly surprising?
Well, I think there's an assumption that people who work in the nonprofit sector are often called to the work because of values alignment, because they believe in the goals of the organization, because they feel that having an impact really is one of the things that gets them up every day. And so I think for us, it was actually surprising to see that the levels of dissatisfaction with employment in the sector are higher than in the private sector or in government. There are a number of possible explanations. We don't know the reasons. We just know the patterns, and the fact that the level of dissatisfaction was, between 30 and 40% higher than in the private sector and much higher than in the government sector, I think really gave us pause.
So obviously, of interest to the nonprofit sector is this low level of job satisfaction, especially in a sector that, as you say, touts meaningful work as a hiring advantage. What do you think is contributing to this lower job satisfaction? Have you given some thought, or do the findings sort of reveal certain trends that might be occurring?
Well, the other thing that the study shows is that many workers in this sector are precarious and do not have enough income. So I think the rate it stands, it's just, we didn't test for this, but I think it makes some sense. And we know this from other research, that workers in the sector often are paid minimum wage or barely above minimum wage. And, if you're living in a large metropolitan area, we know with inflation, cost of living, and so on, that's very difficult to survive. So it's great to have meaningful work, but if you can't pay your rent and feed your family, that could be one of the contributing factors. So I think that's one thing we want to explore in more detail, because certainly precarity, not having enough income, were much more frequently reported in the sector than in the private sector or government, and that would make sense. The second thing is the surveys were done during COVID, and so the burden in terms of work and mental health stress and burnout and expectations and needs um, put on the sector during COVID. Lots has been written about that as being a real challenge. And so that would be another potential explanation, is the work was just way harder during the last few years than it has been previously. And what people have had to cope with and deal with in carrying out their jobs, I'm sure has been really, really stressful and difficult. So that could be another explanation. But it also, what I found also, I won't say concerning, but interesting to think about, is that people who were in management um, positions in the sector had higher levels of satisfaction. So, what exactly does that mean? One might infer that if you're paid well in the sector and you have a lot of autonomy and control, then the meaningfulness of the work and those other two things taken together produce higher levels of satisfaction. So I think that's also interesting. The final factor that I think we need to think about is that in the sector, people are more likely to have reported discrimination and unfair treatment at work than in the private sector or in government. And that may actually really blow people's minds, because again, there's this notion that the nonprofit sector is the sort of bastion of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and so on. And the lived experience of people working in the sector seems to suggest that that is not the case.
I guess, well, you've actually sort of uh, you've really been able to kind of predict where I was going with this, because I wanted to ask you about demographics. And I'm curious whether you saw certain demographic groups that were showing the lowest job satisfaction, or at least reporting some of these incidents that you talked about. There does seem to appear to be an equity aspect at work here. What can we dig into that a bit more and explore those findings?
Of course, one of the issues was youth were more likely to be dissatisfied. Could that be a result of expectations? People coming into the sector expect to have opportunities, be treated certain ways, and so on, and are discouraged. We know that women dominate the sector. The majority of people working in the sector are women, and they're far more likely than men to report being dissatisfied. In fact, almost a third of women in the sector reported being unsatisfied with their work. Now, again, we know that COVID hit women harder than others, especially women who had family obligations, women who bore the lion's share of unpaid work. We know that mental health impacts of COVID on women were really profound. So we may be seeing a combination of things. But as you know, Mary, there have also been studies suggesting that women, especially in certain roles in the sector, are more subject to sexual harassment and not very favorable working conditions. So all of that may be maybe bundled in here. And as I said, the sample was still relatively small. It was under 700 people. So we can't tease out all of the combinations and permutations of demographic factors. But it did seem that women and youth were more dissatisfied than others.
Now, I understand the report also found that more than half of racialized nonprofit workers had experienced some sort of racial discrimination, as you mentioned earlier, and a higher percentage than in any other sectors, including the private sectors. What are your thoughts on this? What can explain this? Because surely, um, we're going to be seeing discrimination in the private sector, if not the public sector. Why do these data points seem to leap out that way?
Again, it's only speculation. We need to do more research. I think what I would be inclined to say is in private sector organizations and in government, which were the comparators, you tend to have well-developed HR practices and processes. Expectations are codified, and so on and so forth. Um, it may also be that a lot of the people responding were working for smaller nonprofits where there's very little capacity, based on the work that we've done on equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's not that there aren't good intentions, but there often aren't the processes in place for dealing with the issues, for addressing complaints, for managing. And we know that the pyramid tends to be dominated at the top by non-racialized people who may or may not have a real understanding of what the issues people on the front lines are facing day in, day out. So I think it points to that. It also points to the precarity of many of the people who are working in the sector again. And if you are in precarious employment, if you are um, if you're a part-time worker, if it's your first job, if it's your pathway into employment as a newcomer, when you see things, you're not likely or as likely to speak out or try to address them for fear of losing your job. So I think it's, again, a combination of the fact that the nonprofit sector may give opportunities to more racialized and newcomer segments of the population, but they may not actually have the capacity internally to deal with the needs of those groups. We hear a lot about people being hired and then finding the work environments are not very inclusive. And I've heard stories of, people going to work in nonprofits where they're playing Christmas carols 24/7. And for someone who's Muslim, that's going to be very, very disconcerting. But what do you do if it's your first job and you're trying to get a foothold in Canada? It may also be that when people are under stress, they behave badly. And during COVID, during the efforts to meet these growing requirements with reduced resources, a lot of workplaces, have become very unpleasant or even toxic. And I think as well, the fact that often in the nonprofit sector, we have assumptions about our commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion without necessarily testing the extent to which those are being actualized is also something we have to grapple with.
Well, the report isn't just sounding an alarm on the nonprofit sector's current workforce and their ability to recruit new workers, but also on their ability to retain future leaders, i.e., younger workers who may be the folks that will take the leadership positions in the future. What do you think the sector needs to do to turn this around?
Well, we always argue that equity, diversity, and inclusion, as you know, are key competitive advantages, not just in terms of ensuring you have policies and programs which serve more diverse communities, but also that you can attract, retain, and advance the best and the brightest. Because as Canada is changing, you have to be able to tap into those pools of talent. And what's interesting to me is that the comments around discrimination were not just based on race. In fact, gender, women who dominate the sector, 41% indicated that the experience of discrimination was as a result of their gender. Think about that. It's a women dominated sector where women experience discrimination. So I think it's a bit of a wake up call. Again, small sample, but it's the findings are not inconsistent with those other studies that have been done of the sector in terms of representation, in terms of EDI practices. And as you know, I think what gets measured gets done. And I think that the sector, while it has um, a an ethos around social justice, a commitment, at least in principle, to being inclusive. I think without good data and accountability, we don't actually know what's going on the ground. And as I've said before, it's ironic to me that I work in a university that's subject to far less scrutiny in terms of EDI practices than large private sector corporations like banks are. And so I think some of the efforts to tighten up the accountability around EDI are really, really important.
And I guess you mentioned earlier the issue around the lack of resources among smaller nonprofits also being potentially an issue because they just don't have the HR infrastructure in place. I mean, absent getting a windfall of donations to some of these large organizations or I don't know, some sort of government funding under a program that is trying to assist them in having greater administrative capacity, um, how does a nonprofit organization like that address some of these problems of dissatisfaction? What can they do?
Well, I think, it's interesting. You're very familiar with the 50/30 challenge, and I don't want to always talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it because 50/30 challenge is focused on gender parity, increased representation in on boards and or in senior leadership roles across sectors, including the nonprofits. And of course, you can't change who's at the top of the house if you don't change who comes in the door. So the work that the 50/30 challenge and the ecosystem partners have been doing is really focused on exactly what you're talking about, which is trying to build capacity in organizations around equity, diversity, and inclusion through everything from, training to the diversity assessment tool that you're very familiar with, which will help organizations identify what their HR practices should be, what their policies should be, but also give them examples of what the language should be, what the mechanism should be, what the process should be. So I do think there are resources out there, and I think organizations like yours have played a really important role in helping nonprofits navigate some of the resources that are available to them to help move this forward. And I get completely that everybody's busy and everybody's burnt out and everybody's fighting for a share of the pie. But I'll come back to what I said before, which is, the benefits of doing this well translate not just into a more satisfied and engaged workforce, not just into better services for the people that are your clients, not just a better value proposition for potential funders, but also a way to build your brand and protect the organization from risk. Because if you mess this up, and when you have this many dissatisfied people, the risks are really real in terms of how that can translate into reputational damage, financial challenges, legal challenges, and so on. So I do think this needs to be regarded as a critical strategic issue for organizations, large or small.
You mentioned earlier, as just in closing, you mentioned earlier that a lot of this data came during at a time during the pandemic when nonprofits were so challenged, and uh, I venture a guess that many people naturally were feeling dissatisfied on all fronts of their lives, including their work. Do you anticipate doing more research around these issues, and if so, is it possible that this is kind of being a blip in the data around dissatisfaction, or is this merely sort of something that's been building over time?
It's a really, really, really good question. We know that overall, across sectors, we are seeing more dissatisfaction, more burnout, um, more demanding workforce, and we have generational differences, all sorts of dynamics. We are going into field with another wave of surveys, and I think one of the things that we need to do is try to unpack the data over time to see, as you said, whether this is a blip or whether or not this is the new normal. And employers really need to be thinking harder about how to keep employees satisfied, engaged, and and retained, because we know the research shows really clearly engaged employees, satisfied employees perform better and stick around. And in the current environment, there's competition for talent. And so this really does need to be a strategic concern.
Well, the report, Burden of Care, was certainly a wake up call, really important research that Future Skills Center and the Diversity Institute was involved in bringing this important research to the public. Wendy, thank you, both you and your team at the Future Skills Center and at the Diversity Institute, for all your excellent work on this report and your keen insights that are always so valuable. This will be so helpful for nonprofits to really try to navigate these disturbing issues that the report Burden of Care has uncovered. Thanks for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks for having me, as always.